As we hear the president say once again that he would prefer to see peace, he wants diplomacy to potentially prevail here. Are we getting any closer to a diplomatic resolution to this conflict?
We are no closer to a diplomatic resolution than we were when President Trump was inaugurated in January of 25. The real problem is that Russia is engaging in what I would call performative negotiations. Putin doesn't want to annoy President Trump. He doesn't want any more sanctions on Russia. And therefore, the Russians pretend that they're really interested in ending the war. But they have not modified their maximal demands on Ukraine since these negotiations began. And those terms are unacceptable for Ukraine if it wants to remain an independent sovereign state.
Well, and certainly they're not slowing down their military action either overnight. Russia keeping up with his attacks, according to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskiy, launching 420 drones, 39 missiles on 8 different regions of Ukraine, partially targeting energy infrastructure, injuring dozens, including children. Angela, does that actually tell us kind of everything we need to know about where Russia is right now?
I really think it does. And Russia has been increasing its attacks and bombardment both of the Ukrainian energy infrastructure and civilian targets in the last year. And every time there are some more negotiations, this time just between the US and Ukraine, but even when there were trilateral negotiations with Russia, these bombardments increased. And Putin has again said, we're nowhere near to ending this war. And so, the best I think that the Ukrainians can hope for today in Geneva is to get assurances from the United States about what they call a prosperity package, which will be economic investment in Ukraine. But that's once the war is over. And otherwise, Zelensky has said that there will probably be, as you said, trilateral negotiations again in March. But the last time there were those negotiations, the Russians sent as their chief negotiator someone who really doesn't have that much power and was mainly there to, again, give the false narrative about Putin, which Putin has many times given, which is that Ukraine is really part of Russia.
Well, so who, if we are to see another set of trilateral negotiations, who would Russia need to send for you to see it as credible, as actually being in good faith?
So I think they would have to go back to where they were before, which is to send the head of their military intelligence agency as the chief negotiator, but then also someone like Yuri Ushakov, who is President Putin's main foreign policy advisor. And he was present at the very beginning at some of the discussions with the United States, but he hasn't been seen since then negotiating with the Ukrainians. So I think that would be one signal. But I think the main signal would be if Russia really were willing to stop its bombardment and to show some good faith that it wants to achieve a ceasefire, and at the moment it's not interested in that.
Well, and to get back to what you were mentioning earlier, this idea that there is a fundamental disconnect between Russia's objectives and what Ukraine is willing to agree to, issues of Ukrainian sovereign territory, which Russia obviously does not view that way, Angela. How can we possibly come to an agreement on that ever, regardless of who is sent to the negotiating table?
Well, I think the problem is as long as you have President Putin in power, and as long as the Russians are insisting that Ukraine has to give territory to Russia in eastern Ukraine, which Russia doesn't control, it's going to be very, very difficult to come to any agreement. One could theoretically at least say there's a ceasefire and there won't be any more attacks at the moment. The Ukrainians have said that they would be willing to have a demilitarized zone in the area that Russia wants Ukraine to give up, but the Russians have rejected that. If you could have a ceasefire, then you could at least think about what comes afterwards. But the Russians are now saying no ceasefire until Ukraine has made all these concessions. And the Ukrainians are saying they have to have some credible security guarantees from the Europeans with a backup from the United States in order for them to also agree to a ceasefire.
Well, so are the Europeans doing and promising enough here, Angela, or they simply can't do it enough on their own?
I mean, they're promising, some countries are promising as much as they can. The British, the French, the Germans, some other countries are willing to send some troops into Western Ukraine as a security guarantee, but that's only once the war is over. But I think everyone agrees without a US backstop, and that would mean continued US intelligence support for Ukraine, but also some kind of insurance that if the Russians then attacked again, the US would be involved also in pushing back. And the Trump administration hasn't agreed to do that yet. And the Europeans, I think, by themselves, without US backing, it would be very difficult for them to provide the security guarantees to Ukraine that Ukraine would need in order to deter Russia. That's the key question. How could you then deter Russia from relaunching an invasion once it had recouped some of its military?
We just have 30 seconds left, Angela, but where would you put the odds that we're still having a conversation about an ongoing war at this time next year when we mark 5 years?
I would say the odds, unfortunately, are rather high that we'll be still discussing this in a year.